Welcome to the Ascent of Mount Carmel YouTube channel. This is a channel where we discuss the book Ascent of Mount Carmel by St. John of the Cross. We break it down chapter by chapter. And as you recall, in the first book of Ascent of Mount Carmel, St. John discussed the apprehensions that we receive naturally through the bodily senses. Then we got to the second book. And with the 11th chapter, St. John discussed the phenomena that come supernaturally through the bodily senses, and we broke that chapter down into 3 parts. Now in this chapter, St. John discusses supernatural apprehensions that he calls imaginary visions.
Imaginary visions are more sublime than things of the senses. However, they're not as profound as the spiritual visions that St. John first introduced to us in chapter 11, and St. John will be returning to these more profound spiritual visions in the next chapter and break those down in greater detail.
Now here's how they work. The first part happens in a natural manner, and our 5 senses naturally present images to the intellectual faculty of the memory. It's here where we archive and store all the intelligible forms and images that we experienced in the past. And our imagination reformulates and filters those images. And we can also imagine variations of those images. The understanding considers the images and then judges them. Now, with imaginary visions, these images are supernaturally presented to our understanding without the use of our outward senses. When we receive these imaginary visions, we know they aren't corporeal. The visions are seen by our interior sight. In her book, The Interior Castle, St. Teresa of Avila tells us that imaginary visions are brief and they pass very quickly. The book of Numbers tells us that direct communication from God, such as what was experienced by Moses, is vastly superior to the indirect communication that may come from imaginary visions. If there be among you a prophet of the Lord, I will appear to him in a vision, or I will speak to him in a dream. But it's not so with my servant Moses, who is most faithful in all my house. For I speak to him mouth to mouth and plainly, and not by riddles and figures, doth he see the Lord. These imaginary visions are sort of like the phenomena that we discussed in the 11th chapter. Both God and the devil can present similar images, so we can never really know the author of the imaginary visions. It is held that the devil is more liable to deceive people than by other visions I have already described. This is probably true. Yet when imaginary visions are divine, they seem in a certain manner more profitable for us than the others, as being more suited to our nature. The devil tries to deceive us with visions and dreams since he knows that most people put a great deal of stock in these things. Imaginary visions that come from the devil may appear to be very good things to us. It is written, Satan himself transforms himself into an angel of light. Imaginary visions rely on our inner sense of imagination. Because of that, St. John tells us that the imaginary visions may have a greater effect on us because they are more subtle and more interior. Both God and the devil have the ability to supernaturally present forms and images to the understanding. Because it's the door and entrance to our souls, the devil especially likes to make use of our imagination. However, we should note that God has additional means to instruct the soul, and we're going to discuss those in future chapters. So we can never be certain whether an imaginary vision comes from God or the devil. Therefore, like the supernatural phenomena that we discussed earlier, we should not take any heed of them. We should not feed upon them, and we should not even desire to have them. St. John tells us that these visions can't serve as approximate means to union with God because they're related to the bodily senses. Imaginary visions are tied to images, and so they're limited by those images. Now, in contrast, divine union and the wisdom of God isn't limited by any particular image or any particular type of intelligence. Visions of God, where he looks like a human being, just can't be accurate since he has no form or likeness. You heard the voice of his words, but you saw not any form at all. Our souls and divine wisdom are very distant from one another. In order for them to become united, it's necessary for us to conform our souls so that there is some element of mutual resemblance. Therefore, our souls must become pure and simple. They can't be bound or attached by any particular kind of intelligence or limited by images. Now please note that even while we reject imaginary visions, they will still produce a positive effect on our souls. And this is because at the moment they present themselves to our imagination, they produce in the soul and infuse it into intelligence or love or whatever other effect God wills it to produce. They produce their effect on our souls passively without any effort on our part. And we don't hinder this effect if we reject them. St. John compares the soul to a window, and that window wouldn't be able to impede a ray of sunlight even if it wanted to. And when a window is clean and pure, it receives light passively without any labor on its own part. And in the same way, the soul passively receives influences and subtle spiritual communications of imaginary visions, even if we resist them and reject them. St. John tells us that as we progress and we become completely detached from imaginary visions, we will actually likely receive them with greater frequency. We need to realize that what we see in imaginary visions is unimportant. We shouldn't waste any time analyzing them or trying to determine their meaning. We would be analyzing the images, and the images aren't proximate to God. The most important part of imaginary visions is the spiritual part. And that part can't be either apprehended or understood, but that's the part that is infused into our souls. If our souls desire to feed upon the images of imaginary visions, the visions will occupy us in such a way that they're going to prevent God from simply and freely communicating the spiritual benefits of the visions to us. St. John compares the difference between the images of imaginary visions and the spiritual benefits of those visions to the difference between the rind of a fruit and the flesh of a fruit. While we occupy ourselves with the rind, we aren't eating the fruit, and we're not deriving any benefit of the fruit. Imaginary visions don't make for a sound foundation of faith. We can't be caught up with images of things of the senses. We should strive for what belongs to something greater, to the Spirit. We won't be guided by faith unless we close our eyes to the things of the senses. And no matter how compelling those images might be, we must remain in darkness with our eyes closed to all worldly lights. In the darkness, and guided by faith alone, which is darkness to the understanding, we're going to find the divine light, and to that we're going to cling. And we must not fall by the wayside and cling to other bright lights that we encounter along the way or during our journey. So in summary, God doesn't give us imaginary visions in order for us to desire them. So you might ask, why does God give us these things that he doesn't want us to desire? Why doesn't he give them at all? And especially, why would he give them, since imaginary visions might cause some people to be hindered by them, or they might just fall into serious errors and perils? Couldn't God just come directly to the soul and communicate it directly without using any images? St. John will answer these questions in the next chapter. He'll elaborate on God's purpose in sending us the imaginary visions. St. John also tells us that some spiritual directors think that just because a vision may be true and that it may come from God, that it's acceptable to believe in them, to take stock in them, and to trust in them, not realizing that the soul will become too attached to them and be hindered by them. And it's a very slippery slope trying to discern what visions come from God and what visions don't. So I hope you enjoyed this installment. We'll be back again in about a week with another one. So in the meantime, please pray for the church.
Oh, Lord, I want you to help me. Oh, Lord, I want you to help me. Help me on my journey, help me on my way.